Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Albert Wenger, partner at Union Square Ventures. Hi, Albert. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. You were one of the earliest investors in this space, and I used to be your partner, Fred Wilson's lawyer, a long time ago. He used to hang out on the Bitcoin subreddit, gouging the temperature of the community before investing early in Coinbase. And you have invested directly into a number of protocol level projects. How positive are you feeling about the industry as a whole right now?
Well, this is a particularly exciting time period, I think, because there's a couple of different things coming together. One is that obviously there's been a lot of activity on Ethereum, especially in the sort of DeFi space. On the other hand, that very activity has shown some of the issues that Ethereum has today, as people are encountering, $50 gas fees, for example. That in parallel, there's a whole set of new chains that have launched or are launching, including some of the ones that we've invested in, such as Algorand launched over a year ago, but there are other things like Near and Solana. So there's a lot of activity in the space, and there's a lot of technological progress. So I think it's a very exciting moment. I also would caution that at the same time, there are a lot of people operating in the space who seem to think that somehow the fundamental laws of reality can be rewritten. I just encountered a project that was premised on there being a 1% interest rate daily. And I think there's some fundamental misunderstandings about why some things exist or don't or can't exist in the world. And so I guess I would say there's sort of a bit of magical thinking involved in some of the projects that are out there. And so it's an exciting time, and certainly one that we're following very, very closely.
Has your investment thesis evolved versus, say, 3 years ago?
Well, I think we, in the early investing, we're very focused on the infrastructure layer, so projects like Blockstack or Algorand or Filecoin, or Helium, those are all sort of infrastructure layer projects. Arweave. We do think that, the infrastructure is really now coming along. And so we are starting to look more at applications. And obviously we have some investments that have applications as well, something like Dapper, for example. Definitely feels like we're sort of on the cusp of a shift towards where the infrastructure is there. I don't think we can say it's there today, but I think one can see that it will be there. And so definitely now is a good time to really start thinking about applications and what's happening at the application layer.
So focusing on identity, which you've talked about extensively, the IRS recently announced a $625K bounty program to find a solution to trace privacy coins such as Monero, with CipherTrace saying they have had success. In the past, you've said you believe that transparency is a real opportunity we have here rather than complete privacy. Does the rise of DeFi actually play into that line of thinking as people realize the value of real-time public data across markets?
I don't know. I think this is a super, super complicated area, right? So I think that we continue to believe that end-user controlled identity is a really important piece of the overall puzzle. So if you think about your identity on the internet today, what part of it do you really meaningfully control yourself? You don't really control your email accounts. That's usually with, a Google or some other big provider. Your Twitter handle is something that Twitter controls. Domain names, I think, are pretty good, but, they're complicated for most people, like registering one and then putting a site there. It's getting easier, but it's still complicated. So we do continue to think that sort of self-sovereign identity, and something you could delegate to a host, but something that you could take from one host to another host, and that you really control meaningfully is sort of a crucial enabler of decentralized systems. Now, I think the discussion around private or shielded or whatever you want to call them payments is a whole other important and I think very complicated discussion. And the reason I say it's complicated is because we're in this time period where people, I think, rightly are concerned about the power of government and whether government will and is abusing its power. And we're rightly concerned that, even in the US, we may be slipping ever further away from a democratic government and from a government where you can rely on separation of powers, where you have a well-functioning judicial system, into one where these things are not there. And in that kind of world, the ability to make shielded payments becomes very important as a way of citizens protecting themselves from the state. On the other hand, I think it's very well understood, and has been for a long time, that cash doesn't just protect citizens, but it also makes government corruption, for example, much harder to trace, right? And so I think many of the advocates of shielded payments, unfortunately, always only tell one side of the story. And the other side of the story is that this also facilitates corruption. So I think the answer is it's very complicated. And I think anybody who goes, the answer is obviously X, and we should obviously be doing Y, I think is sort of either intentionally or erroneously painting a picture that doesn't capture the complexity of the situation.
And any role you think that what's happening now in DeFi and the Rails being built can help with this?
Well, I think that within DeFi, there's, I think, projects that are really interesting, and we're investors in Uniswap, and obviously there was, been a real interesting sort of drama around Uniswap and SushiSwap and so forth. But I think the interesting aspect is that we're beginning to understand now that the native version, meaning that native version for blockchain of how a problem is solved, may not look like the same problem is solved in the centralized finance world. So I think early on, a lot of people thought the way to provide liquidity is to replicate many of the things that we find in the centralized finance world. So you replicate an exchange, you replicate an order book. And it turned out that because of the different and more powerful, in a way, primitives available on a blockchain, it turned out that on-chain liquidity can be provided in a more native fashion. And I'm not suggesting that Uniswap is the only project that's doing that. There are definitely other projects also. But that, I think, is kind of a breakthrough. It's a breakthrough in a broader sense, in the sense that we're beginning to understand that this isn't about copying the existing institutions. This is about creating truly new ones. And this is a little bit, this is a history that repeats itself in technology, right? So early television was filmed radio until people figured out how to do actual television shows. And so in a way, I think early crypto was, we need an order book and we need an exchange. And then now I think crypto is coming into its own, where it's like, hey, there's a totally different way of doing this that's actually more powerful and more native to the capability set. So I think that's a very exciting development.
And who do you think, if some of these projects end up having some losses or retail investors get hurt, who should be liable? Should venture investors be liable for the projects they're backing?
Well, I mean, in general, in the US, our approach has been to have a corporate shield, right? And so liability extends to investors only, for example, in cases of fraud, and even in cases of fraud, extends to investors only if they were part of that fraud. So I do think we have a legal framework for this, but I think it does speak to a broader question, which is always the question of what is the ultimate recourse here, and where do you want to draw the line on recourse? And do you want, I mean, this is a discussion that goes back to the DAO and the DAO hack, the draining of the DAO. And again, I think, there's some people who are like, well, the code is law. And so if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And if you lose money, you lose money. So it's, caveat emptor. It's all, the risk is pushed out. And I think that over time, we will find a balance. One of the things that I think is super interesting, for example, is to tie it back to the discussion we just had, is, are there native insurance solutions? So again, I think, people have first thought about this as well, let's bring traditional insurance schemes into crypto. But I think the more interesting question is, just like Uniswap represents a native version of on-chain liquidity, is there a native version of on-chain insurance? I have no idea what that would look like, by the way. I'm just saying that I think is the line of thinking that we need to engage in, rather than the thinking that insurance is bad altogether, or it can't be done, or bringing in sort of an outside non-crypto insurance scheme into it. So I think there's still a lot of innovation that needs to be in place for this to be really broadly and widely adopted.
And we've seen Nexus Mutual and other iterations happening in that regard already. So yeah, I agree. So talking about the devastating wildfires that are going on in the US right now, and they happen in Australia earlier in the year. And we've spoken about the many ways that blockchain can be used as a tool to combat climate change. What do you think about that? Can more seamless markets, the type you can imagine DeFi innovators building, deliver highly efficient energy markets, or can the convergence of IoT and blockchain detect climate change and then have smart contracts reward via crypto some reductions in greenhouse gases? What are the ways that we can use this technology for good?
Well, I think it's always good to go back to first principles and sort of say, what is a blockchain actually good at? And what it's good at is, permissionless consensus, right? So anybody can join a consensus, anybody can join essentially a database if you so want. And so from there, we can sort of ask, what are some interesting applications for that? And I think the market for carbon offsets is a really interesting potential application for this. This is a market that has a lot of issues, and blockchain in and of themselves doesn't necessarily magically solve them, but it can form a new system where people can register offsets, and where you can see, for example, let's take forest, where you could sort of make it very clear that a certain set of trees has actually already been sold. So I'm not selling the Brooklyn Bridge, to 7 different buyers, right? Now, it doesn't solve all problems, because there's still the issue of, like, do I even own this forest and have the right to sell it? That's one, problem that one needs to understand. And the other thing is, what's the ongoing monitoring? So, I say I have a bunch of trees here, I post a nice photograph of it, and then, I sell it, and next day I cut all those trees down. So, there's certain problems here that I think blockchain can solve, such as sort of creating a system where you don't have some complicated global process where people need to be vetted and joined. But conversely, if you have an open system that people can join permissionlessly, then you need to deal with so how is, ownership established? It goes back to the identity conversation we had earlier. How is ongoing monitoring? So which ties to the whole more general Oracle problem. So how do you, and I think there are solutions for all of these things. So for example, you could envision something where people who analyze satellite images, where they sort of attest to those trees actually still being there with some frequency. And you can envision a system where they need to stake, and if somebody else can present credible images that show that those trees are not in fact there, then maybe their stake is slashed. So, but again, I think much as in the earlier discussion, these systems will take a lot of thinking, a lot of iteration, a lot of getting it wrong, and they're not going to be trivial systems if they are really, truly addressing the problem.
Well, Albert, thank you so much for being with us today. So great to hear your insights, and appreciate you taking the time.
No, my pleasure. I really enjoyed this.